In this last part of our Chapter 9 presentations, we'll just say a few words about 9/11, have a very brief discussion about the aftermath of 9/11, and just mention a few key points about ISIS. We're not going to delve into the actual attacks on 9/11. I've assigned some videos to you that do a much better job of this. I just want to mention a couple key points. One of the big failures of 9/11 was that our security system was mainly set up to prevent bombs being smuggled onto airplanes rather than airplanes being used as bombs. Most of any experience we had with hijackers in the past were with hijackers who wanted to live, who planned to hijack a plane, have it fly to a destination of their choosing, and for them to survive. Obviously, the 9/11 attackers had different incentives and different plans. Their idea was not just to bring a bomb onto a plane to get their way and have the plane hijacked to a different location, or to plant a bomb onto the plane to be exploded without them being on it. But these were hijackers who planned to take over the plane, as we all know, and to fly it into buildings and in the process kill themselves. So U.S. security wasn't really designed for that. I'm guessing that most of you who are listening to this really don't remember pre-9/11. But as someone who's old, like myself, I can remember the security before 9/11, and terrorism wasn't a really great concern. Yes, it was a concern, and there was security at airports, and you had to pass through security checkpoints. But taking things like box cutters onto an airplane in your carry-on luggage wasn't something that was seen as a great threat, because again, we didn't think of the people who were willing to die when they took over the airplane. That they would want to survive, or that they were planning to hijack the plane and kill anyone, including the pilots, while they were on it. So we didn't really view things that could be used as weapons, but traditionally weren't, like box cutters, as major threats. So we just didn't have the security apparatus set up to deal with that kind of situation. Obviously, after 9/11, we've taken a different approach. As we know, nearly 3,000 people died on 9/11. At the Pentagon, at the World Trade Center, and in the plane that crashed in Shanksville, Pennsylvania. There was also untold billions of dollars of immediate and long-term damage. 9/11 certainly had a rippling effect on the American economy and helped to contribute to the recession of the early 2000s. Post 9/11, we almost immediately engaged in a military response against Al-Qaeda strongholds in Afghanistan. Now, the difference between our actions in Afghanistan and in the Second Gulf War is that the United States did a very good job under the Bush administration of forming an international coalition. So before going into Afghanistan, the U.S. worked really hard to gain international approval to do so and international cooperation. We didn't do that with the Second Gulf War. Most of the international world was against going back into Iraq, but the United States did it anyways and pretty much acted on its own with only a couple allies. Their response to Al-Qaeda and Afghanistan was much more successful because of the international coalition that they formed. Obviously, one of our major goals was to hunt down the leaders of Al-Qaeda. We've largely done that. We've decapitated much of, and not literally decapitated, but we've removed many of the who were the early leaders of Al-Qaeda. And so we may question whether they're still capable of carrying out significant attacks like 9/11. There's some doubt whether Al-Qaeda really has the resources and the wherewithal to do that. But nonetheless, this hunt obviously took and continues to take significant efforts. Bin Laden wasn't killed until 2011, so it took us 10 years to find and kill Bin Laden. You watched a video, albeit it may not be a completely trustworthy video, but video of an interview of someone who was involved in that operation. There are questions about whether the killing of Bin Laden violated international law. Should the U.S. have gone into Pakistan without first alerting the Pakistanis that they were and getting the permission to fly into Pakistani airspace and carry out the operation. Well, if we had done so, we'd have probably tipped off bin Laden and he would have been gone. So there are legal international law experts, there are international law experts who believe that the raid was completely legal, but you will find others who will say that it violated international law. It may be a moot point because no sanctions have been levied on the United States, nor will there ever be any sanctions levied on the United States because of the attacks. Another consequence of 9/11 was the creation of the Department of Homeland Security. We realized we needed to better coordinate our efforts to fight terrorism, that terrorism now became a higher priority offense. Before 9/11, we were concerned about terrorism, but we really viewed it as something that happened abroad, not something that happened in the United States. And so it wasn't a high priority for the federal government, for our national government. After 9/11, obviously, it became a high priority. So we created the Department of Homeland Security. There still are agencies, major agencies that are outside the Department of Homeland Security. For instance, the FBI is still housed within the Department of Justice and not Homeland Security. But the Homeland Security Department was an important step towards better coordination of our efforts against terrorism. The USA Patriot Act was passed almost immediately after 9/11. It was passed so quickly, and it's such a complicated law that most suspected that the Bush administration already had most of it in the works before 9/11 happened. And that isn't some kind of conspiracy theory that the Bush administration was complicit in the 9/11 attacks, but they were planning to trot out some of these increased surveillance provisions of the USA Patriot Act. So the book is still out on whether the USA Patriot Act really added anything to our counterterrorism efforts. The act did allow for better communication between the CIA and the FBI. It did provide for more surveillance powers, but if you talk to most people who are in counterterrorism, who are actively engaged in it as intelligence agents, they'll often say the problem is not getting more information, it's being able to handle and process the information that we already have. Because these threats don't come into these intelligence agencies with neon lights flashing saying this is a serious threat, take it seriously, follow up on it, etc., etc., etc. You have to analyze the data. You have to figure out what is this data really telling you, if anything. Is this a wild goose chase? Is this something we should really act upon? Is this important information? And so getting more access to even more data may be helpful, but it's not going to be very helpful unless we have the tools to actually analyze it and really accurately assess whether this is a significant threat or not. Finally, a few words about ISIS. ISIS is also known as ISIL. So President Obama typically referred to ISIS as ISIL. They're both the same thing. They just have different terms for the regions where they want to establish the Islamic State. So ISIS stands for the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria. ISIL has a more traditional term for the region of Syria that they wish to control, which is the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant. Regardless of its name, whether it's ISIS or ISIL, that's your own preference. What we do know is that ISIS grew out of the power voids that were left because of the wars in Iraq and the civil war in Syria. Where there is an absence of power, we'll typically see other groups coming in who don't have official authority, who aren't actually recognized as the government of those countries. We'll see those groups coming in to try to fill those power voids, to try to take over those regions. And so ISIS certainly did that. ISIS is different from Al-Qaeda in that Al-Qaeda never really tried to hold territory and fight conventional battles. That wasn't their main MO, their method of operation. Instead, Al-Qaeda was more devoted to terrorist attacks. ISIS, instead, has tried to hold territory. Again, they want to establish an Islamic State, so they want to set up their own particular government. So they've held territory, they've taken over industries like the oil industry to finance their military activities, and they've actually engaged in conventional battles against military forces. Today, the tide could change, but it appears that the tide is against ISIS. It's that the American influenced forces have the Western forces have been getting more and more have been enjoying more and more success against ISIS, and ISIS has been losing influence and territory. This started even before some of the victories by the American-led or American-supported forces. Kind of like when the Mujahideen went to Afghanistan, when ISIS fighters, when Muslim extremists came to ISIS, they really had these dreams of um, fighting in heroic battles and gaining fame and celebrity and everything else, and gaining a quick passage to heaven. Instead, what they found was the reality of warfare. They found that the leaders of ISIS weren't perfect, that they often suspected that leaders were more concerned about protecting their own image than serving the cause, and that they were more devoted to themselves and enriching themselves than actually fighting for the cause of ISIS and establishing an Islamic State. The fighters also found that they didn't receive the money that they were promised for fighting in the war. They had terrible food. They found that they really couldn't stomach the mass beheadings that often took place. And so the reality of warfare often sank in, and even though they were under the threat of death if they deserted, ISIS lost a lot of fighters through desertion. And so, whether you're ISIS or Al Qaeda, there are the human sides of fighting in these kinds of wars, and that by saying there's a human side, that doesn't mean you excuse the behavior and the atrocities that they carry out, but it is saying that there are management problems, just like for any other organization. And if you don't manage your fighters, they're going to soon move on to somebody else, or they're going to move out of the field. They're not going to be fighters anymore, or they're going to go to some other group that seems to be more organized. And so ISIS had some problems from the very beginning, and now with coalition forces being used against them, greater effectiveness, they seem to be losing influence and losing territory. Hopefully this will be a trend that continues, and ISIS will be less of a threat in the future than it has been in the past.